Hi, everyone. Welcome and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever it is you're tuning in from. Thank you so much for joining us virtually today. My name is Hayla Alawi, and on behalf of Atmosphere Press, I am so pleased to welcome you to today's live author reading, Shifting Paradigms. We'll be hearing from Barb Higgins, reading from Motherland, Living with Child Loss and Becoming a Mother Again at 57, released May 12th. Ted Garrison, reading from The Missionary Kid Talks, released July 1st, and Peter P. Mahoney, reading from I Was a Hero Once, releasing September 24th. All three authors' books can be purchased both from online retailers and from select bookstores. And of course, the books can be ordered on Atmosphere Press's website. That's at atmospherepress.com/books. And I'm just going to put some links in the chat for everyone too. At the end of today's event, we are going to have time for your questions. So during the readings, if you have a question for one or more of our authors, go ahead and type those in the chat and I'll make sure they get asked. Please do stay muted for the duration of the event, but feel free to use that chat for any praise and comments as well. And one last note is that we at Atmosphere Press appreciate your support today and always. If you have a manuscript of your own, we would love to read it, so submit your work today to books@atmospherepress.com. Again, thank you so much for tuning in and supporting Barb, Ted, and Peter today. We're going to start off with our first reader, who is Barb Higgins. Barb graduated from Boston University with a master's in education. She also has a certificate of advanced graduate studies from Plymouth State University in education leadership through arts integration. She has taught elementary, special, and physical education as well as health, and has coached cross country and track and field for over 30 years. A Division I All-American in track and field at BU in 1983, Barb was a competitive runner for many years, competing for Nike before returning to her hometown in 1989. Barb coaches and participates in CrossFit and has a podcast called A Thousand Tiny Steps. Creating the Molly B Foundation helps to keep the best parts of Molly alive and helps others to achieve their goals. Today, we'll be hearing Barb read from Motherland, where she finds herself on the brink of collapse. Her world is about to shatter even further with the sudden death of her 13-year-old daughter, Molly. In the days, months, and years that follow, Barb navigates the treacherous territory she dubs Motherland, a realm characterized by heartbreak and beauty, hope and devastation, blame and loss. With determination, she takes countless small steps toward healing and rediscovering hope. We'll hear more now from Barb herself.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. So my book is called Motherland, and I really do write through the perspective of a mother, not just about Molly and her death, but all that goes into trying to maintain whatever being a mother is during all of that. So I'm going to start by reading the introduction to the book because it sort of gives a good overview of what you can expect if you ever read it. Call it A Thousand Tiny Steps. There are two things I've learned from losing my 13-year-old daughter, Molly. The first is that no event takes place in isolation. When the impossible happens, like our child dying, we act as though it came out of the blue. We say that we were blindsided, that the rug was pulled out from under us, that we didn't see it coming. We act shocked. We're not the people this kind of thing happens to, we say. I'm not the kind of mother who's meant to have a dead child. Of course, none of this is true. Nothing ever arrives out of the blue, not the good things or the really bad things. I know that now. I now know everything is more connected than we could ever imagine, that there's an intricate network of threads between each moment, each decision, and every living thing. I know that there are 1,000 tiny steps that lead to things that happen to us, to the greatest losses of our lives, and that from every one of those moments, there are another 1,000 tiny steps to a place of healing, to a new life. It takes a particular kind of attention to see those steps, a kind of aerial view of our lives, like the perspective of an astronaut has of the Earth from space. Everything suddenly makes a kind of sense, even though we can't explain it. That those steps redraw the boundaries between countries, between land and sea. And underneath it all, there's a place that connects every thought and word, every moment to every living thing. I call it Motherland. The second thing I now know to be true is this: there's nothing sacred or holy or untouchable about a mother who loses a child. We deify grieving mothers. Perhaps it all goes back to Mary watching her son dying on the cross. When a mother must face that most cruel and unnatural of tragedies, the death of her child, it somehow turns her into a saint. We look at her suffering and her grief and her survival of this tragedy with admiration. She must be superhuman, we think, to get through this. We even go so far as to think that maybe there's a reason she was picked to go through this rather than the rest of us mortals, with living, breathing children. You're so brave, people say. If it were me, I don't know how I'd survive it. You're incredible for getting through all this. Grieving mothers are special and holy and sacred. That's the narrative we like to spin. The reality couldn't be more different. The grieving mother is as lost and terrified and broken and flawed as the next person. Sometimes more so. Sometimes the grief makes us not more holy, but less so. We turn to our baser selves rather than our higher selves. We go to the dark places, often places we went to before the child loss, places that bring immediate comfort and relief, only this time the stakes are higher, and so is the fall. My dark place was addiction, to drugs, to alcohol, and to the poor choices, often surrounding men, that accompanied these addictions. I'd do anything to turn back the clock, to rewrite the story of the months leading up to Molly's death, and those months that followed her death as well. I'd do anything to make sure I was the mother she needed and deserved. I wish that I had savored every moment with her. I wish that I'd always been loving and patient and kind. I wish that I'd made her feel seen and understood. We'd argued less. I wish that when I lay beside her on the hospital bed, after the life support machine was turned off, waiting for her heart to stop, that I'd been able to feel at peace, knowing that I'd been a good mother. Though, of course, there is no such thing. A good mother is as much of a fabrication as the saintly grieving mother. We are always no more or less than ourselves, beautiful and broken, extraordinary and flawed, less than we would like to be, and at times more too. The year leading up to Molly's death was awful. Kenny, my husband, had put us into such debt that I had no choice but to divorce him to secure our family home, my savings, my livelihood. But he was not the only one to blame. I had started a relationship with Roy, a man I had loved and known on and off for 6 years. Neither Molly nor her 15-year-old sister Gracie liked him. He was possessive and controlling and kept trying to pull me away from my children. And often I let him. Kenny and I took turns to live with Gracie and Molly in our family home and in the apartment we'd rented a few miles away. One week, Kenny was with them, the other week, me. Kenny and I couldn't live under the same roof anymore. I kept telling myself that any moment now my life was going to blow up. I felt it in my bones, that something bad was going to happen. But still, I kept making the decisions. Kenny drank heavily, even though he was on dialysis, even though his kidneys were failing. If anyone was going to die, I told myself at that time, it was him. He was in late-stage renal failure. I assumed that the gut feeling I had, that something bad was going to happen, was connected to him. But that's the trouble with those terrible, prescient feelings. They're often realized in ways you could never have imagined. It wasn't Kenny who was about to die. I also drank too much and took some drugs. I kept poor company. In the week leading up to Molly's death, in the last days of my 13-year-old daughter's life, I was 3,000 miles away from her in Europe. I was with Roy in his bed when Kenny called me to say our daughter was in the hospital and I needed to come home immediately. And in the years after Molly's death, I wasn't any better. I didn't suddenly become wise and good, purified by the tragedy of losing my child. I fell into addiction again. I let people down, most of all Gracie, who deserved better. And of course, I let myself down too. But at some point, when the madness of grief turned to something else, not a resignation or an acceptance, never that, maybe the ability to lift my head just a little on wobbly legs, I tentatively took a new step, one tiny step forward, a step toward another kind of life. And that step, too, I know, is connected to the 1,000 tiny steps that came before. I believe that without Molly, there would never have been Jack, the 2-year-old sitting at my feet as I write this, which doesn't make any of it better. It doesn't take pain away. It doesn't justify Molly's death. It doesn't bring her back. What I still wish for every second of every day. but it's a step forward, a tiny step forward in this strange and dark and beautiful and complicated place I called Motherland. Tiny step toward life. So I find oftentimes in memoirs, especially I've read a ton about child loss, they paint these beautiful stories of these picturesque families, and I'm always left wondering what was life really like, which is why I'm honest in the opening of the book. I'm going to read two excerpts now that really focus on Molly. And the first one is called The Pink Dress, and it actually opens the book. So I'll read that now. And it's about a shopping excursion she took days before she died. Low in the back, sleeveless, fitted at the top, an empire waist, the pink dress that Molly would be buried in. When I got back to the house Sunday morning, Gracie greeted me with a hug. I held her tight and breathed in her skin. I was so glad to be home. My mom had been staying with Gracie while Kenny, Molly's dad, drove behind the ambulance to the hospital. He was already in the ER at the local hospital in our town in New Hampshire with Molly. I grabbed my car keys. Let's go, I said to Gracie. I needed to get to Molly. She'd been sick all night, lying on the bathroom floor, throwing up, her headache so bad she couldn't keep her eyes open, and I hadn't been there for her. Before we go, you just have to see the dress, Mom, Gracie said, taking my hand. She was so excited to show me that I went with it. And I told myself, Molly's in the hospital now. She's in good hands. A few more minutes away from her won't hurt. Sure, I said, following her up the stairs. I had planned out the whole week for the girls while I was in Amsterdam. On the afternoon of Gracie's birthday, they went to the mall with my mom and my sister. I'd left them some money so they could treat themselves. Molly and Gracie had texted me pictures. I remember thinking that Molly looked haggard, which supported what Kenny said about her headaches. The picture haunts me now. Why didn't I say something? Why hadn't I forced Kenny to bring Molly into the ER earlier? Why hadn't I just flown home? They'd bought other things that day too, bath salts and candles, a swan floaty that we'd use in the pool, and the dress. Gracie and Molly weren't just sisters, they were best friends, two halves of a whole. Although they were born 2 years apart, they may well have been twins. Gracie was so excited about the dress, it could have been her own. Molly hung it up on your door, Mom, so you'd see it the minute you walked in. Gracie took the dress off the hanger and held it out. Isn't it pretty, Mom? She said. It was gorgeous, an Aubrey Hepburn-style dress, elegant like Molly, and pink, her favorite color. I would wonder later if these things had worked against Molly, her feminine elegance, her love of pink, the fact quite simply that she was a girl. Just wait till you see her in it, Gracie said. Eyes shone. I smiled and took Gracie's arm. Come on, let's go. She nodded and hung the dress back on the door. I told myself that in a few hours, when the doctors had found out what was wrong with Molly, and they'd given her some medication to make her feel better, we'd all come back home. And once again, get caught up on some sleep. Molly would put on the dress and twirl around the house for us. I'd tell her that I was sorry that I went to Amsterdam, and that I was sorry I wasn't there for her when she needed me. She'd give me a hard time about it. I told you not to go, she'd say. But she'd forgive me, and she'd keep twirling around in that beautiful pink dress, and we'd move on with our lives. I looked at Gracie. She was still in her PJs. Why don't you get dressed? I asked. It's okay. I'll just throw some shoes on, she said, believing, like me, that we'd be back home soon, that everything was going to turn out okay. So that's been a really tough memory for me as well, because all I can think about is when they were shopping and when Molly bought the dress and all her plans for wearing it, and not knowing that less than 10 days later she'd be in a pink casket wearing the dress. So the final piece I'm going to share is a quick piece about a really good friend of Molly's in his goodbye to her. And it's poignant in a way I'll tell you when I'm done reading. Because of Gracie and the extra time she had fought for, the last goodbyes were some of the most precious and moving. Molly spent a week on life support at the hospital, so hundreds of people came to say goodbye to her. Another bus driver came. No, I apologize. No, I'm right. I'm sorry. Another bus driver came. Brenda, her second grade teacher who loved Molly, came. She sat at her bedside and thanked her for being such a kind and curious student. Skylar, her best friend from childhood, hadn't heard that she was sick, came in with her mother holding a Vermont teddy bear with Molly's name on it. An aunt who lost her son to a brain tumor when he was 8 said goodbye through FaceTime, but she was too far away to come in. More dance and school friends, a small, skinny boy with a get well soon balloon, who, ignored by his peers, had been picked out by Molly to work on a project. His mother told me that he was in love with her. As I watched him standing there, clutching his get well soon balloon, my heart broke. Broke for how it wasn't just me who was losing Molly. Xander was losing her as well. Hundreds of people were losing her, the girl who saw it as her purpose in life to make them happy. And it was because of Gracie, Molly got to have her first and last kiss from a boy she'd likely have fallen in love with, a tender moment, one of the many times I realized that. It was Gracie who brought him into Molly's room for his final goodbye. As he leaned over her body, the girl he danced with and acted with on stage and spent years with as a best friend, tears dropped from his eyes, and then lightly he kissed her goodbye. For both, I believe, it was their first kiss. For Molly, it was also her last. I cried for her, watching that moment, knowing how much this boy meant to Molly, and how this was just one in a long list of beautiful futures she was going to miss. This future grief is perhaps the hardest part of childhood. You don't just mourn who they were, but who they might have become. So this boy, his name was Derek, and one of his deathbed promises to Molly is that he would dance on Broadway. And last week, Gracie and I went to New York City to watch him perform in The Great Gatsby, which is currently on Broadway. So I have a hard time sharing it without crying, because when we went backstage after to chat with him, he just said, I never gave up on that promise. And he's a Broadway dancer now. So yes, child loss is tragic, but so many beautiful things have come from it that really it's an ongoing experience for me. So that's what I chose to read. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Barb, and thank you for giving us those different sort of anecdotes, those different moments from different points in the book, and really painting that picture. I mean, just like you said, it's really something else to see how those positive moments shine through, and hearing about this up and coming Broadway star like this, it's just amazing, you know. So anyway, thank you for your reading.
Thank you.
Of course. And reading next today is Ted Garrison. Ted was born and raised by missionaries in India and then studied theology and psychology and ended up working with seniors in hospice care. He has learned numerous spiritual technologies and eventually found the synthesis of them all in the human design system. After marrying a Muslim woman and struggling to be a bridge between his Jewish Christian world and Islam, Ted wrote a complete text using Theo-Human Design System to show the synthesis of all world religions. He also began a daily poetry writing practice over 20 years ago. Today, we'll be hearing from Ted's powerful memoir, in which a missionary kid shares their story of redemption and recovery from the destructive forces of religious obsession and sex addiction. Through a harrowing journey of self-discovery and healing, this story offers a message of hope for a divided world. Ted, take it away.
Thank you. So I just thought I'd read three shorter pieces, sort of the beginning, and then a little story from my childhood, and then I tried at one point to be a stand-up comedian, which is a devastating thing to try to do. So the first chapter is short, called Conception, a Story. I grew up in India where my parents were missionaries, and the year before I was born, my dad was having an affair. By the way, this book is about, a lot of it is about the first half anyway, about compulsivity, problems, addiction, sex addiction. Not the most popular topic in the world, but it's around. I grew up in India where my parents are missionaries. In the year before I was born, my dad was having an affair and had to get rid of my mom. My life is haunted by sin, adultery, attempted murder, being left for dead. My birth certificate is a letter written by the doctor who delivered me. He used an instrument to pull me out by the head, claiming my long toes were gripping my mother's ribs. The pressure on my skull squeezed the two sides together, forming a subtle mountain range on my skull. The doctor said, to whom it may concern, Theodore Levitt Garrison, male, was born in the Methodist Hospital, Nodiad, on September 2nd, 1954, the son of American missionaries. Reverend and Mrs. John Garrison were residing at the time at Mission House, Viramgam, Gujarat. My mother's real name was Leona Ruth Beerns. Her parents were also missionaries, but I don't know her side of the story. My dad's story seems to dominate and threaten my outer world. Mom's story remains to be told. When I get curious about people's religious ancestry, most American kids will claim, until interrogated, no idea, as though they've popped into the world from nowhere and arrived without a story or a reason. Maybe they're ashamed of something. Maybe they are the product of the secular conscience. Well, then, if they happen to be white, Anglo Saxon, Protestant, American Zionists, and bored to death with the current version of that story, read on. So, Dad was having an affair with a young, single, lonely missionary woman who lived about 100 kilometers from Nudiat. My brother was 5 years older than me, and my two younger sisters were not yet born. I've tried to calculate when the attempted murder must have taken place, July or August in the year before I was born. A determined silence pervades the whole event. As a kid, I knew nothing of it except that Mom had slipped somewhere, somehow, and had fallen down a cliff, resulting in a broken neck and a good sized indentation in the very crown of her skull. As new missionaries, my wife and I were on our way to Pakistan. My parents were staying at the time at a mission compound in Missouri. I had waited 7 years for a convenient time to have our first conversation about the accident. 7 years earlier, I was in my first year of Bible college. My brother, in his post Vietnam wandering years, visited me in my dorm room. He told me how he always walked point into the jungles and went on a lot of reconnaissance missions. Picking up dead American soldiers was probably the most dangerous assignment. But what he really wanted to tell me was the truth about Mom's accident. Mom did not fall off a cliff. Dad pushed her over, he said. It happened above Woodstock School at the top of the hill along the Chukkar somewhere. I would attend Woodstock School from grades 7 through 12. So I was finally able to ask my mom what really happened. She shared as much details as she could, and then, like one of those events, where were you for Kennedy, the Twin Towers? With a hint of a grin, she turned to me, the heavy glow of an orange sunset on her face, and said, when the body cast came off, you were conceived in a fit of reconciliation. The words were so well chosen, and I imagine she must have rehearsed them. What will I tell Ted when we finally have to talk? You're a fit of reconciliation. And the shock of when the body cast came off, I was mystified. It felt tangible, as though I had just been handed the theme for my movie. And then just another little story about an event. I experienced some miracles in my life, but only one that actually touched me. During a summer vacation between Sunrise School and Woodstock School, a friend from the mission school and I rode our bikes from Nasik to Pune. The event happened toward the end of the second day of our journey. We'd spent the night in an obscure Catholic monastery on the other edge of the village. Two white boys on bicycles was a spectacle. Coming into the village, a crowd of kids came running at us. We were exhausted and just wanted to know where we could lie down and spend the night. Kids knew right away how to help us. They rushed us, running along as we pedaled slowly to this little monastery compound. I did not know there were other kinds of missionaries. We were each led to a tiny monastic cell and promptly handed a bowl of plain black beans. I got my wish to eat something and lie down. The room had a bed and a cross on the wall. A poignant and deliberate silence terminated conversation. I must have slept soundly. But remember that I did wake up feeling remarkably refreshed. We got on our bikes and left without saying a word. After cycling all day, we were ready to stop when suddenly the ghats, these valleys, opened up and we were speeding downhill. I was tired, and after pedaling for so long on the flat, had forgotten the geometry pertaining to momentum and sharp corners. Not far down the hill, rounding a corner, a bus was coming at me from the other direction. I was forced to nudge to the right, away from the turn in the road and hurtling toward the edge of a cliff. The bike tires began to skid on the tiny rocks as I tried to adjust my trajectory. I managed to glance to an unthinkable distance below, huge boulders and trees at the bottom. There was no way I could change my direction. Talk about staring death in the face. But as I came to the edge in the act of the launch, I was suddenly, firmly, and deliberately shoved by a force that set me upright and at the proper angle to the road. Something, a sensation of raw strength with strong open palms, caught me and also pressed me in the proper direction. I knew without a doubt that God had just saved my life. It was beyond belief. It happened to me. It had to be a miracle and the proof that Jesus is real. He had physically intervened to save me from certain death. What happened didn't involve any faith or belief. It was done to me. I couldn't get over it. So that's the story I told everyone. But, however, everyone around me were other missionary kids and their parents. How my fellow believers marveled at the intervention of God on my behalf. And I'd still be telling the same story if only some wicked, unbelieving person had not mentioned probably the wind coming up from the valley floor actually pushed you back on the road. That was weird to me to understand. I felt a sinking sense of truth in the naturalistic explanation. For a while, when sharing this event with others, I'd inwardly veered from the notion of the wind and returned to my Bible story. It took me years to accept the truth. It felt like blasphemy. In the believer's story, God saved me. In a godless world, the wind, the miracle, remains. And then one more little piece, little story I'm proud of. My grandfather's name was Alleluia Irenaeus, and his brother's name was Ezekiel. They were raised in India as missionary kids themselves. As 20-year-olds, they were reading the Bible and concluded that Jesus would return, but much sooner than anyone else had realized. And it says in the Bible, everyone on earth needed to be warned first before the event itself. And think of the thousands of villagers in India who have never even heard the name Jesus. They would have to be warned, but how? The situation was so urgent that only by flying could they possibly reach the teeming millions. They prayed for an entire year, seeking faith to help them make the leap and trust in God for the flight. God can perform miracles. When the year of prayer was complete, they climbed up on the roof, and after a final prayer meeting, they jumped. But can you imagine two white guys flying into your village only to announce Jesus is about to come? He doesn't have to flap his arms the way we do. He'll burst through the air like Superman. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ted. And I mean, oops, my camera's a little bit blurry, but yeah, thank you for that reading and for kind of showing us these different facets, especially going back into your upbringing and starting from the beginning like that. It really gives us this kind of scope of everything to understand. So our final reader for today is Peter P. Mahoney. Peter served in Vietnam as an infantry lieutenant and after returning home joined Vietnam veterans against the war. In 1972, he was indicted for conspiracy to incite a riot at the Republican Convention, the Gainesville 8 case. In 1983, he worked for the New York Vietnam Veterans Memorial Commission and helped to collect letters written to and from Vietnam. Excerpts of these letters were engraved on the memorial and were published in a book called Dear America, Letters Home from Vietnam. The dedication of the memorial and a ticker tape parade took place in 1985. After a long career in international development, he retired in 2017 and is married with 2 children and lives in Warren, Vermont. In I Was a Hero Once, we hear more from Peter about how he was deployed in 1968 and his world was turned upside down when he joined the army and went to Vietnam. Upon his return, he found himself embroiled in the Vietnam Veterans Against the War movement. So, more of the story will unfold now with Peter. Oh, Peter, it looks like you are still muted.
Yeah, I was trying to unmute myself there, which I was able to do. So I have excerpts from 5 different chapters in my book, most of them fairly short. First is from a chapter called You're in the Army Now. Running away from the complications I had imposed on myself was a big part of my decision to join the Army, but it was more complex than that. When I dropped out of college, I lost my student deferment, and my draft board had been sending draft notices to my parents' house, which my mother, in a fit of pique over my clandestine departure, had been sending back to the draft board marked addressee unknown. But there was more to it than that. Part of it was a residue of working class patriotism, one of the strong ideals I had grown up with. Mahoney's had been serving in the military since the Civil War. My great uncles had served in the Civil War, my grandfather served in World War I, and my father and uncle served in World War II. Hey, Vietnam was my war. It was a no-brainer. Mostly, though, I needed to prove myself, to establish my manhood in the quintessential American way, by participation in a war. My father kept his military service mementos in an old sea trunk in the attic. Once my brother Henry and I had convinced him to open it, and among the pictures and uniform remnants, we saw the medals my father had been awarded, including a Bronze Star with a V device, denoting heroism, the fourth highest military decoration. We asked him what he had done to receive it, and he joked that he had jumped overboard to save a case of beer. He never did tell us the reason, which only added to its aura. The medals were tangible proof that my father had faced the test of courage and not been found wanting. I wanted medals too, so no one could ever doubt my bravery. Set squarely against this patriotic zeal and the need to prove myself was another set of ideals that continued to gnaw at my conscience. My generation, many of us fueled by the inspiring words of John Kennedy, "Ask not what your country can do for you," had championed movements for free speech, civil rights, and women's rights. I had never actively participated in any of these causes, but had cheered from the sidelines as others did. In February of 1968, the greatest cause of the boomers, the anti-war movement, exploded into the national consciousness. The NBA and Viet Cong had launched the Tet Offensive, a massive coordinated series of attacks on most of the major cities, towns, and military installations in South Vietnam. Although the offensive was ultimately a huge military defeat for the enemy, it was an even greater political defeat for the United States. It shattered the illusion that all was going well and that an American victory was just around the corner. It soured large portions of the American public on their political and military leaders, showing them up as naive Pollyannas at best or downright liars at worst. What had started out as small student protests against the draft burgeoned into massive multi-generational demonstrations to end the war, as the horror being perpetrated in Vietnam were nightly televised into American living rooms, and the lies of the government became too obvious to ignore. It was a major turning point in the war. Although I was aware of all of this, even felt sympathetic towards it, it didn't sway me from my chosen course. The next one is from the chapter about being in Vietnam. As part of the Vietnamization program, the South Vietnamese created something called the People's Self-Defense Force, PSDF, a part-time village-level civilian militia ostensibly organized to protect their homes and villages from the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army. The theory was that as the ARVNs, that's the Army of the Republic of South Vietnam, gradually took over the main line fighting from the American forces, and as the Rough Puffs moved up to fill the security role previously held by the ARVNs, the PSDF would provide a deterrent from VC infiltration. Despite the known VC leanings of the three hamlets in our area of operations, the district created a PSDF unit from the hamlets, a group of 23 teenage kids, 15 to 17 years old, the only ones left in the hamlets who could reasonably be organized into some sort of fighting force. My mobile advisory team was given the assignment to train them. We put them through a 3-week training course, which included training on a motley assortment of weapons that had been handed down to them from the Rough Puffs when they got their M16s. At the end of the training, there was a flashy province-wide graduation ceremony with big speeches from the province chief and other dignitaries, and all of the PSDF were given colorful neckerchiefs to wear. Then one night, about 6 weeks from the graduation ceremony, a local VC cadre came into the hamlets and apparently made his own speech. And all 23 PSDF graduates walked off with him to join the Viet Cong, taking their weapons and our training with them. The daily incident report stated that all of them had been kidnapped. The whole event had a profound impact on me. I already had serious doubts about the American efforts in Vietnam, but here I had personally trained 23 kids who ultimately made a conscious choice to fight on the opposite side, despite knowing the might and power of the military force arrayed against them. If they believed that strongly, then who was I to tell them to believe differently? This is from the chapter called Coming Home. A few weeks into my first semester at the University of New Orleans, I spied a leaflet on a bulletin board that announced the formation of a chapter of Vietnam Veterans Against the War. I had been regretting not joining the demonstration in DC earlier that year and saw this as my chance to get involved. My anti-war opinions were not particularly well formed at that time, consisting of such thoughts as, the war is bad, it should stop. Participation in anti-war activity seemed a necessary component of the hippie lifestyle I was attempting to adopt, and VVAW seemed the natural way for me to get started. There was another reason for my attending this meeting. I was feeling distinctly alienated from most of my classmates. These were kids who were freshly graduated from high school, younger than me, and most definitely worlds apart from me in life experience. I didn't feel comfortable around them and didn't want to talk to them about what I had gone through and what I was going through as a result. Vietnam had turned me into an adrenaline junkie, and there were few fixes in everyday campus life that satisfied my craving. I took to doing things like sucking on razor blades during classes, or leaning out the open door of a car and dragging my lengthening hair along the pavement as the car sped down the highway at 60 miles an hour. More than anything else, I was attracted to VVAW because I wanted to be around other vets who might possibly understand how I was feeling. I showed up at the appointed time and place and found a room with about 20 people in it. The meeting was chaired by a guy named Don Donner, who identified himself as the regional coordinator for VVAW for Arkansas, Mississippi, and Louisiana. He had come down to New Orleans from Arkansas to try to stimulate veterans' anti-war activity in the Crescent City. He announced that our first action as a chapter would be to march in the annual Veterans Day Parade in New Orleans. The organizers of the parade, the traditional veterans organizations such as the VFW and the American Legion, had put out a call inviting all bona fide veterans groups to join the parade, and VVAW applied to march. The older veterans groups were not enthused about this idea and initially rejected our application. Then some local lawyers got involved, and eventually we received a begrudging agreement. 33 of us showed up that night for the parade at the designated location. We watched and waited as a parade of spangled high school bands and motley groups of older veterans, complacent in their hard-hearted patriotism, passed us by. Finally, we demanded to know when we would be allowed to march. The parade organizers then sprang on us the news that Congressman F. Edward Hebert, the Grand Marshal of the parade and recently selected as chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, had decreed that no anti-war groups were going to march in his parade. We tried to negotiate some sort of alternative, like marching down the sidewalk instead of the street, but we were told that if we marched anywhere that night, we would be arrested. Our response was, flock it. We marched and got busted for parading without a permit. I didn't say flock it in the book, by the way. The police held us overnight and then released us the following morning without bail. The case never went to court. The purpose of the arrest was to get us off the street so we wouldn't spoil F. Edwards' parade. So the first time in my life I was ever arrested was for trying to march in my first Veterans Day parade after I got back from Vietnam. It was not to be my last arrest. The next is from the chapter about the trial of the Gainesville Eight. The next witness called by the prosecution was Charles Henry Becker, my friend Carl from New Orleans. His long red hair had been cut short and neat, and his straggly red beard had been shaved off. He identified himself as an FBI informer, an intelligence operator for the New Orleans Police Department, and an undercover security agent for a New Orleans department store specializing in liquor, whose job was to catch shoplifters. My co-defendants were already convinced that he was an informer. It cut me to the quick to find out how wrong I was when I had defended him. Becker studiously avoided any eye contact with the defense committee during his testimony, with the defense table during his testimony. But as Brady Coleman began the cross-examination, I went over and stood behind Brady, staring intently at Becker. He still refused to look at me. After a brief recess, Judge Arno instructed me to sit back down at the defense table, since the witness had complained that I was trying to intimidate him. I guess when you betray a friend, having to look him in the eye must seem like a form of intimidation. After that first day of testimony from Carl, I was feeling like crap, not just because of his utter betrayal of me, but also because I was stupid enough to have ever considered him a friend to begin with. We were on our way back to the defense house for one of the endless lawyer-defendant meetings to go over the current day's proceedings and the plan for the next day. When you have 7 lawyers and 8 defendants, coming to a consensus can be a long and arduous process. In preparation for that evening's anticipated marathon, we stopped by a local pizza parlor to grab a couple of pies. The guy behind the counter looked like a classic redneck, t-shirt, crew cut, beer belly, and American flag on the wall behind him. His manner was gruff and seemingly inhospitable as he took our order. Needless to say, my fellow defendants and I were rather well known in those parts in those days, and our bearded, ponytailed, anti-war buttoned appearance contrasted rather starkly with our pizza parlor host. As we were waiting for the pies, the man continually scowled at us in what seemed to be a particularly disapproving way. I was honestly worried he might jump over the counter and assault us, or maybe just refuse to sell us the pizzas. I was wrong. When the pies came, the man scowled at us again, then gave us a big smile. He handed us the pies, shook each of our hands, and wished us all good luck. He also refused to take payment for our food. I needed that. This is from the chapter on the Memorial Commission. The process of getting the signed permission slips, verifying the facts, and verifying the facts may be privy to all kinds of personal information about the men and women who had written and received the letters. I knew about the soldier whose father moved in with his wife while his son was fighting in Vietnam. I knew about the POW who committed suicide 6 months after being released from North Vietnam. I knew about the gay infantryman and the drug-abusing officer. I met the father of George Olson, 75th Ranger Regiment, one of the most articulate letter writers we had. After Olson graduated from St. John's University, he immediately volunteered to become an Army Ranger and undergo what was perhaps the most grueling training regiment in the most elite fighting force in the military. He probably could have avoided military service altogether had he chosen to do so. His father showed up at the Memorial Commission office one day to return the permission form in person. He was a quintessential New York City blue-collar guy. He reminded me of my own father. It is always difficult to know what to say to the parent of a slain soldier. I awkwardly murmured that he must be proud of his son. He gave me such a look, filled with pain and anger and loss, and said to me, "My son is dead. What is there to be proud of?" And I suddenly saw the anguish of a working-class father whose dreams of seeing his college-educated son succeed in life in ways he never could have had been snuffed out in the paddies of Vietnam. The memorial we created, I think, is as complex and as nuanced as the era we were trying to reflect. That is both the beauty and the flaw of the memorial. Most people don't do nuance. They want their history in simplified sound bites, summed up in 10 words or less. They want their memorials to elicit a single overpowering emotion, preferably one of heroism and glorification of the soldier. This memorial does not answer questions, it stimulates them. It does not glorify soldiers. It highlights the ordinariness of the individuals called upon to endure extraordinary circumstances in war. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for being candid with us. I know there's a lot to unpack there and a lot of emotion there, so thank you for that reading. At this time, we do have time for our audience Q&A, so if anyone has a question from one or more of our authors, please go ahead and type those in the chat and I'll make sure they get asked. I do have a question here to start off the Q&A. This is for all three authors. This question is, all of your books are steeped in the memoir tradition. What were your feelings as you were writing these books and reflecting on these experiences to write about them? Was it cathartic? Did you experience pain you perhaps weren't expecting? Belated anger, other things? Maybe if we could go in reading order. So Barb, do you want to start us off with this one?
The short answer would be yes. You feel all of those things, or at least it was that way for me. I know for me, by the time I was ready to even contemplate writing the memoir, I'd gone through a lawsuit, all that goes into a lawsuit, and then the birth of a child. And well, actually, when I started writing the book, I was growing the child. But I would say the overriding part of it for me was cathartic. And I also know that a lot of what I went through, people are uncomfortable talking about. Like that's the hardest part for me, is to find someone that gets it, that's either lost a child or understands what this is all like, which I imagine is very true for Peter and Ted. I couldn't keep the tears in my head listening to Peter read. You know, I was 10 years old when he came home and had all those troubles, and I have never forgotten all of that. So I think for me, and I imagine for anyone that writes a memoir, it's incredibly cathartic, like purging it, getting it out, and figuring out a way to share it in a meaningful way so other people can. That was how it was for me.
Yeah, definitely. I can, understand where that kind of sense comes from. Even if it is steeped in that pain, it can be really almost therapeutic to have that writing experience serve in that way. Ted, what about you? Or what were your feelings as you were writing this book?
I really had come to writing in 97, 98. I never thought I'd write, but some kids at Naropa, I was in Boulder, and they were like, "You really write?" I was writing rants and stuff. And they said, "You're a poet." And I'm like, I don't write poetry. I don't like poetry. But I really didn't know how to write anyway, just exciting. And then in 2014, I got a DUI. So I had a year. By the way, if anybody gets a DUI, just don't worry about it. Just tell them, like, write a book. You know, use the time to write a book. So I divided the year into 4 quarters, and I wrote diary, I wrote poetry, I wrote essays, and I wrote for just one. This whole book came out of just 3 months of just, I didn't know how to write it, so I just threw it into 5-year sections and wrote it out as best I could, and worked on it. But it for sure cathartic, uh, and the bits of my story that I told to people is like, this is a book, this is a movie. You have to do something. You have to get this down. But it's not a story. A lot of it is, I'm not proud of it, and I don't want to advertise that. But it's, at least it's in the book, and if anybody wants to judge me for anything, it's like, well, it's in the book, and this is what humans do, and I feel really proud of myself in some ways for the grace of higher forces, Allah Ta'ala, in my life to have led me through all of that, and I feel really normal and happy. And I'm glad this book is sort of out of the way. I'd like to go on and write more poetry and some essays on the synthesis of religion, so I don't want to focus on my narrative so much, but it's there. And I think it's a fascinating story for anyone who's interested.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like this kind of sense of relief that it's the
Yeah,
writing portion is finished and it's out there, but it sounds like also there was a lot of positivity that came out of it and just that introspection for sure.
yeah.
Um, Peter, what about you? What were you perhaps surprised by, or what did you kind of feel internally as you were writing this book?
Well, it took me 20 years to write the book. Um, uh, and I there were a couple of things, I guess. Number one is I'm a storyteller. I've always been a storyteller, and obviously I have a few stories to tell. But the second bigger thing I think was I wrote the book for my children because, sort of after all of these adventures happened in my life, I pretty much went back to a very normal middle class suburban existence, kind of like what I originally came from. And and that's how my two children knew me. They knew me as this sort of soccer dad, this suburban dad who not particularly exciting or interesting. And I really kind of wanted them to know who I was and what I did before I became their father. So that was one of the motivating factors for me to write the book, and also just to get the stories down and I always wanted to make a difference in my life. Despite the fact that I had a lot of adventures when I was younger, I wasn't sure whether those adventures really amounted to a whole lot of anything. And so by writing about those things, I'm hoping that maybe I could give, a little bit more meaning to them than what they were when they actually happened.
Yeah, it can kind of start as the seed of wanting to pass on those stories and it can like really blossom beyond that. So I think a lot of us can say that we're really happy that it did blossom into something more that we can all share in now. This is another question for all three authors. This person says, did you learn something about yourself that you were surprised to learn as you were writing your book, even though you were writing about past experiences? So maybe Ted, do you want to start us off with this one?
Um, I was surprised that, I mean, I've always been intimidated by just normal writing. I write poetry as an excuse to, because I don't know how to write. Uh, but this was like the discipline of just taking time to write good sentences. And I think the book still needs work, but that surprised me, that the thrill of editing and getting things right was a great discipline, and I'm grateful to Atmosphere for making me go through that. I tend to want everything. I don't edit. I mean, I have begun to really enjoy editing poetry, but years I just was so fascinated by the weird relationship between my speech and my mind and writing and readings, like these four different things. How do they work together? And poetry writing, at least a la Gertrude Stein, is just this weird, continuous process. That's what fascinates me about writing. But the discipline of putting sentences together in a coherent way, it was great. It was great discipline for anybody. So
Yeah,
I still need to work on that more.
I feel like every writer is always, feels that way, right? I still have to work on it. And, when is a project even finished? Because you can look back and think, oh, I wish I had done this thing differently.
Yeah,
But yeah, I'm so happy to hear, you found this joy in almost like the puzzle of the writing process.
puzzle.
Yeah, Peter, what about you? Did you learn something about yourself that you were surprised to learn as you were writing?
I don't know if I was surprised to learn, but I was pleased to learn, let's say, that I could actually finish a large writing project. I've I've done a lot of smaller things. I've written, some smaller poetry, some op-ed pieces and for local newspapers and stuff like that. But the idea that that I could actually, write something as, as big as a book was, for most of the time, for most of that 20 years, I was not convinced that I was ever going to get a book out of what I was doing. And, but I did. And, because I just kept plugging away at it. I just, I would sit down and I would say, okay, I'm just going to write 1 page tonight. Okay, just let me get 1 page tonight. And then, then the next night, okay, I'm going to get 1 page tonight. And that's how I did it. I just like eked it out, just like page by page, over the course of 20 years. And, I sort of surprised myself because there's been an awful lot of big projects in my life that I started that I never finished. This was one big project, probably the most important big project in my life, that I started and finished. And that's the thing I found out about myself.
Yeah, it's a daunting task. So the fact that you can undertake it but also complete it is pretty impressive. So yeah, I think we're pleased as well that to see that happened. And then Barb, what about you? Something that you perhaps were surprised to learn as you were writing?
My biggest fear in sharing it, of course, was all the shame and guilt and self-hatred that I think any mother who loses a child has at some point. What did I do wrong? What could I have done better? And I included a lot of, some ugly details from my life that I just feel played into the whole thing. One of my biggest surprises in sharing all of this was the number of people that feel the same way. As a child, I was in a very abusive household, and I learned that being quiet was the safest thing to do. Just don't say anything. And then the status quo remains. And it's amazing in times of strife, personal strife for me, how willing I am to just shut up and not advocate for myself. And this is a 250-page not shutting up experience. And so, like Peter, I'm amazed that I finished it. I have a million half-finished journals and, calendar logs and, daily writing things I start and then I just peter away. But I was able to finish a book and go through the whole process. The other thing that surprised me, writing it was hard enough, but the editing process where you have to take pieces out, maybe rearrange it, maybe not tell so much of this, so to put the focus there. I had no idea that was coming. I thought editing was like, misspelled words and that the editing process was probably the most significant part of writing this book, all of it, because it was like another whole experience. So I think that was a big surprise for me as well. I'm not surprised that it was cathartic for me, but I was surprised at the process of editing and what that took out of me, and that a lot more people agree with me or support me rather than judge me. And that was a kind of a nice surprise.
Yeah, no, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I think, there can be so much involved in the editing process that it can really come as a surprise. Um, so yeah, I mean, thanks for kind of illuminating that, going into that and how that experience unfolded. I do see this one last question in the chat. This is from Steve. Do any of you recommend a how-to book on memoirs? Or if not a how-to, are there any perhaps memoirs that you read or that inspired you to write your own, or that you took kind of style tips from, anything like that? And if, it just came from internal reflection, that is perhaps also helpful to know.
Another great Vietnam memoir is by Bill Earhart, W.D. Earhart, called Passing Time. Again, it's another the book about a Vietnam veteran who becomes anti-war after his service, and I found it to be a wonderful book, and it did sort of inspire me to get my book finished.
I read a number of different memoir kind of related books, but I don't think I got that much out of them. I mean, I just, I'd like to explore maybe different ways it could have been written, but the sequence of the thing was just the easiest way for me to do it.
Yeah.
So I was lucky enough. I have a good friend who's a published author, and I've read all of her books, and several of her books touched on child loss. So I got up the courage to ask her about her experience with child loss because I couldn't imagine that she could write about it so accurately. One of her books talked about sibling loss, and my daughter Gracie said, I never knew Virginia lost a child. That was our reaction to it because it was so accurate. And she hadn't. She's an incredibly talented author that researches well. So my process, she was willing to help me and work with me in how to organize and structure the book. And she would made the book almost an interview for me, and I could answer the questions and she would transcribe my answers, and together we put it together. So I didn't sit by myself and pen this memoir myself. I was smart enough to realize the ADHD in me would prevent it from ever getting done. And she was my sort of my structure and my taskmaster. And I was free then to just tell the story. So that was helpful to me. I also read several memoirs and watched all the movies that are out there on child loss. And while they were helpful to me, they were more helpful to me as a mother losing a child, not a how-to on how to write a memoir. At least that's my experience. But my friend who's an author, Virginia McGregor, was super, super helpful for me in just sort of outlining. It's like a bookshelf and I could just fill it.
Yeah. Well, thank you all three for those answers to those questions, and of course also for your readings, and just being generous with your time and your, sharing these stories are so personal. So especially with memoir, it is so at least for me, it's such an experience to be able to share that with an author. So thank you so much to Barb, Ted, and Peter for being with us today. And thank you to everyone in the audience for coming as well and celebrating these wonderful authors with us. Don't forget that you can order Motherland, The Missionary Kid Talks, and I Was a Hero Once from those links in the chat. I just put them in there one more time, so it's right there. Please also consider checking out atmospherepress.com to browse our new and forthcoming releases, sign up for our email newsletter, or to submit a book manuscript of your own. You can submit your work to books@atmospherepress.com and let us know that you attended today's event. We will look forward to hearing from you, but until then, that's it for today. So have a great rest of your weekend, everyone.